Hey everybody, Shayla here from Stuart Morris Textiles, back today to tell you everything that I know about needle turn applique. If you have been following me on Instagram, you will know that I'm a keen applique artist and have been teaching it for years using the Flora template set. This set of shapes is great for learning applique without being boring, so you can learn and make something beautiful in the process, which is what I want to show you how to do today. There is a lot of information packed into this video, so I wanted to let you know that every Stuart Morris Textiles applique pattern comes with a downloadable 50-page illustrated ebook that has all of this information in it and much more. So do please consider supporting SMT by purchasing a pattern if you enjoy this video and don't want to take 1,000 pages of notes. Let's jump right in. And first off, I want to show you all the tools you'll need to get started. First up, scissors. I suggest having 3 on hand. The first one is your paper cutting scissors, so just normal around the house scissors. The second is your big fabric cutting scissors. And lastly, you want to have a short and sharp set with a sharp tip especially. Next up, the tried and true Fiction pen, which lets you trace your templates and then disappears with heat when you're finished. Hello, Shayla here from Editing Bay to say that you can also use tailor's chalk or any other fabric marking pen if you wish. Just always remember to test whatever you choose on your fabric before you start your project to make sure that it disappears when you're finished and doesn't leave marks. Alright, so next up you want to use pins. These are traditional straight pins, but if you can find them, I highly recommend using these little guys, sometimes called applique pins, sometimes called bead pins, and almost always called sequin pins. You will also need a sewing needle. I will demonstrate with a medium-sized needle here on the left, but I suggest beginners use a long sewing needle. These guys are pretty good for beginners, I think, but no matter what you choose, just make sure you're using a very thin, slender needle for applique. A clear ruler is helpful, but any ruler will do. And you will need thread in the color of your applique shapes. More on this later. And obviously, you will need fabric. I highly recommend Stuart Morris Textiles plant-dyed fat quarters and stitching cloth, because I am biased and I love all the colors I create from my own plant-dyed recipes. Depending on the project you choose, you will need fabric for your applique shapes, as well as a base cloth to stitch your shapes to. And last but not least, you will need templates for your applique project. I am obviously using the Flora template set, which are available in the SMT shop. For this tutorial, I will be working from the physical copies that you can purchase in the shop and have shipped to you, but if you are using the print-at-home PDF downloadable version, there are instructions on how to transfer the shapes onto templates in your download. Alright, let's get started. So the first thing that we are going to do is cut out our templates. This is super simple, just cut along the printed line and voila! We have all of our templates ready to go. Next, using your Fiction pen or tailor's chalk, chase your template onto your fabric. You want to position your template so that you have at least a ½ inch of extra fabric on all sides of your template. With my larger fabric scissors, I am going to roughly cut out my templates, not making my margins too large, but not worrying at this point about making them perfect. I would say I'm cutting about a ½ inch margin all the way around, not worrying about inset curves and points at this stage. Once my shape is cut out, I am going to carefully cut out the perimeter of my shape at roughly 1/8 of an inch all the way around. I'm still not worrying about inset curves and points at this moment, but making sure my margins are consistent and even. If you notice, I am not using a ruler because I have done this approximately 10,000 times, but I do suggest you using a ruler if this is your first time doing needle turn applique. You don't need to measure the entire time you're cutting, but just make sure and check in every once in a while to make sure that your cuts are even and roughly 1/8 of an inch. One thing I cannot emphasize enough is doing this part correctly. Needle turn appliqué has a bad reputation for being difficult, but my honest opinion is because not enough emphasis is placed on proper cutting before you start stitching. If you don't take the time to cut your shapes with the correct margins, and if you don't snip your inverted curves and points correctly, it is not going to look good. So if you spend too much time on any step, make sure it's this one. Proper cutting makes the rest a breeze, I promise. Now with my clear ruler, I'm just going to go all the way around my cutout shape and make sure my margins are 1/8 of an inch or less all the way around my shape. You don't really want it to be much less. You want it to be just about at 1/8 of an inch everywhere. This is going to be especially true for straight lines and curves, which are going to be a lot easier if you have 1/8 of an inch cut margin. Alright, now let's start our trimming. We'll start with points. The great news is that you don't have to do anything or any cutting for points, but I like to cut a shallow V to reduce the amount of fabric that needs to be tucked under when it's time to sew. You may need to do more trimming later, but this is a good start. Next up is inverted curves. For these, you want to clip into the centermost part of the curve to just below the drawn line, and then radiating lines on either side. If it is a deeply inverted curve like the one on the inset picture on the lower right, just barely cut past the drawn margin line at the deepest part of the inverted curve with radiating snips on either side like an upside down peace sign. For longer inverted curves, just make sure you're adding snips about every 1/4 of an inch. For inverted points, you want to first trim either side of the V to 1/8 of an inch margin, and then just snip straight into the center of the V and through the drawn line, but not past it. I'm going to go ahead and trim the point off this point here while I am in the area. Curves are super easy. All you need to do is to make sure they are trimmed to 1/8 of an inch, and that's about it. Lastly, I'm going to cut straight up through the center of this leaf shape. And then there we have it. We are all trimmed and ready to go. When I am placing my shapes on a pillow or quilt, I like to fold my base stitching cloth in half twice to find the center so I can place my shapes knowing spatially where I'm at. All it takes is a finger press to find it and then unfold. It's super simple technique that I use all the time to make my placement of applique shapes very easy. I am going to tack my shapes in place once I like where it is. I am using these long straight pins, though I am loath to do it. But since these are most likely what you have laying around, I will demonstrate with them. You don't need a lot of pins, just enough so your project doesn't move around. I'm going to rotate my shape to begin stitching and let you know that I am right-handed. If you are too, make sure you are stitching around your shape counterclockwise. If you are left-handed, make sure you turn your project 180 to where I am now, and make sure you are stitching clockwise. With my tiny beading / applique / sequin pins, or whatever they are called, I'm going to start folding under the 1/8 of an inch of extra fabric and pinning it in place. I'm going to tack down about 3 inches and then thread my needle and start stitching. When you choose a color of thread for your applique, ideally you want it to match the color of your shape as exactly as possible so the stitches won't be visible. It isn't always possible, but if you have to choose between a slightly lighter or slightly darker thread, always opt for the darker one. When I make a knot at the end of my stitching thread, I like to make it twice so there is no chance of it slipping out. This is why I suggest using a thin needle. A thicker needle will leave a hole so large the knot of your thread can slip through easily. To begin stitching, I'm going to pop my needle under the folded edge of my fabric and pop my needle through to the front side of my shape close to the drawn line but not touching it or on top of it. I will pull my knot to the back of my fabric and then using the side of my needle, tuck the fold and finger press it back down. To begin stitching, enter your needle directly on top of where it came out on your applique shape, but this time through the base cloth. Angle it to the left and pop it back through the front of your applique shape directly to the left of your first stitch. Pull it through and you have finished your first stitch and half of your second. Once again, you're going to stitch directly above your last stitch, angling it and your needle down and to the left of your last stitch and pop your needle out directly to the left of your last stitch, close to but just under the folded under shape edge. Continue in this way, removing pins as you run into them. The key to great applique is consistent, even stitches that are not very visible. If you are new, this most likely won't happen right away, but over time, your muscle memory kicks in and without even knowing it, you will have the most even tiny stitches on all of your work. It happened to me, it can happen to you. Using the same colored thread as your applique shape is going to be key when you first begin because any stitches that are uneven are going to be hidden if you use the right thread. Okay, here's why I hate large pins. If you use standard sewing pins, you are going to constantly be snagging them on giant pins. Ugh. Just buy $2 worth of tiny pins. Trust me. Now let's sew points. Alright, so here are our 2 points. If you notice, I did not trim this one on the right. I did on the left, and I just want to show you what a difference it makes in your final project. On the right, you're trying to tuck under too much fabric, and on the left, it's just right. So here I'm going to trim everything that's sticking out, and it looks a lot like what we do already in the beginning. So I am going to tuck under and sew really close up to the tip of my point, but before I start sewing the tip, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn under my next edge and pin that in place. If I do this, when I am working around the point, it can easily be folded under and match up with where the other side is folded. To work around the point, use the side of your needle to push down the folded under fabric between stitches and the point of your needle to roll it up and down if you push it too far down. This is a very delicate back and forth that is something that you just have to experience many times before you become an expert at it. A little cheat I use on points all the time is to stitch up to right before the point, tuck the fabric too far down, and then pull on the thread from the last stitch, which will place the folded under fabric perfectly behind your point, and you can stitch from there. I like to make more stitches than normal around the points because you're holding a lot of fabric tucked in place, and you want to make it stay. I like the way that this looks. I think it looks pretty good, so we can carry on. Once you have rounded your point, it is straight stitching until you get to an inverted curve. I want to chat for a second about sewing without pins. To be completely honest, I don't use a lot of pins when I am sewing applique shapes. When you're just starting out, they are super helpful, but eventually you will be able to move around your shapes using the side of your needle to tuck your fabric as you go, and the tip of your needle to roll your folded under fabric up or down to perfectly place the drawn outer line of your shape neatly on the fold. A quick finger press and then your thumb and forefinger is all you need to keep your fabric in place while you stitch. Using the side and tip of your needle between stitches to quickly adjust your fabric as you go will take some getting used to, but it will be easy in no time, and your stitching will become faster and faster without having to constantly be moving pins around. Okay, carrying on. Before we get to our inverted points, we need to trim the accompanying point. I have already snipped the tip, but as you work, you will often find more trimming is necessary at points, so be ready with your small snips. Just as before, I'm going to sew a few stitches from my point, then I'm going to stop and tuck under the next side before sewing the point all the way around. On little points like this, that's important because there is often a lot of trimming needed. Being able to just use your needle and thumb is great for little points like this one. There is a lot of adjusting and readjusting your fabric when sewing small areas like this one, but getting it just right so that the drawn line sits right on the folded edge is worth the time in the end. Your project is going to look so much better if you take the time to make your shapes look just like they did when you cut them out of your paper. Alright, inverted points. These are pretty simple. You just need to remember one thing. Both sides of your inverted point create a V, where you made your single cut, which means there is fabric tucked under both sides of the V, but none where your two sides meet. That means you will sew down and up both sides as normal, but due to the lack of fabric where the two sides meet, you want to add a double stitch, slightly longer than your normal stitches, at the center of the V. Before I finish this stitch, I'm just going to turn my work, like I always do, tuck down the next side. Make sure everything is in place using the side of my needle, finger press, and then continue stitching just as before. Alright, let's sew curves. Like I said, curves are super easy. Just make sure that they are trimmed to no more than 1/8 of an inch everywhere along the curve, and the sewing will be a breeze, I promise. Use the side of your needle to tuck under the excess fabric, and finger press the fold when you get it in place before sewing. And that is it. I love curves. I could sew curves all day long. So simple. At some point, you will need to change your thread as you're stitching, so here's how you do it. Finish your last stitch, popping your needle to the back of your work, and stitching into the cloth only behind your shape so it's not seen from the front. Wrap your thread around your needle twice before pulling it through your knot. Do this 2 times so that you make sure you have a very secure end to your thread. When you start your next thread, again make a big knot at the end of your sewing thread and begin sewing, starting your stitches between the last 2 stitches. The final 2 stitches on any thread are a common area for your work to become loose over time. So if we start out our next thread between these 2 stitches, the likelihood of your work becoming loose or undone over time is greatly lessened. Okay, now for my favorite, inverted curves. If you did a good job cutting into these curves, one at the center of your curve and then radiating cuts out from there every 1/4 inch, cutting right up to the line each time, you will have no problem with sewing these down. Snipping these curves incorrectly will give you angular inverted curves that are too shallow, like the one shown here on the right. This one on the left is cut perfectly, and it has a beautiful shape to its inverted curve, and you can see that it matches up pretty much exactly with the template. So make sure your snips are right up to the line on your inverted curves. To tuck your fabric behind, you are just going to take your needle and make a backward scooping motion, and 99% of the time your fabric falls nicely into place. And that's basically all we do to sew down our inverted curves. We just use our needle, scoop, sew, adjust as we need, and voila. And that's it, pretty simple. Once you have made your way around your appliqué shape, it is time to finish. Because we are finishing on an inverted point, I am going to make sure I am using a double stitch at the point of the V. Continue stitching until your stitches meet up where you began stitching at the beginning of your appliqué shape. I am going to finish by stitching 1 stitch between my first and second stitch. This is my final stitch, and therefore I'm going to pop my needle through to the back, pull it through, and then make a double knot through the base fabric only behind my appliqué shape so it isn't seen from the front. I'll do a double knot just as I did before when I switched my thread. And there you go. Just snip off your excess thread, and then you are finished. And that is your shape. You guys should give yourself a giant pat on the back because you have learned something, and perhaps you have followed this tutorial and made something that is beautiful. Thank you guys so much for watching this appliqué tutorial. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I try to respond to all comments. And if you're interested in purchasing any of the plant-dyed fabric that you saw in this tutorial or the Flora template, please check out my shop and see all the other stuff that I make. Thank you guys so much. We'll catch you next time.